Good evening, everyone, and a very warm welcome to tonight's Henry Moore Institute research event. I'm Claire Nadell, Programme Coordinator at the Institute, and I'm delighted to welcome you for a very special closing event to mark the final week of our current exhibition, Julia Crabtree and William Evans' Slip. Tonight is the final event in our series exploring some of the ideas and themes behind the exhibition. We've been using these events to explore the exhibition in further depth, including looking at the materials and collaborative processes that the artists adopt in their practice, and we've also reflected on the presence of bodies and ecosystems in the works on display. Tonight's event focuses on the significance of language to the artist's practice. As Julia Crabtree and William Evans note, verbal linguistic communication is prone to errors and mishaps, and interesting things often come out of the processes of translation, mistranslation, and mistakes. Titles are also very important to the artists, and their works often utilise single word titles which refer to actions, bodies, and organisms, as in slip, heaves, or pause. So to help us think about these ideas further, we are joined tonight by three wonderful writers, Alice Hattrick, Daisy Hilliard, and Daisy Lafarge, who will respond to the exhibition with readings from their own writings and poetry. It's my great pleasure to introduce tonight's speakers, Alice Hattrick, Daisy Hilliard, and Daisy Lafarge. Alice Hattrick is a writer based in London. Their first non-fiction book on illness, intimacy, and mother-daughter relationships, titled Ill Feelings, was published in August 2021. Alice's essays, interviews, and criticism have been published by The White Review, Frieze, Art Review, and Rhizome, among others. And their work has also been included in Whitechapel Gallery's Documents of Contemporary Art Health Anthology. Alice is also the co-producer of Access Docs for Artists, a resource for disabled and or chronically ill practitioners made in collaboration with artists Leah, Clements, and Lizzy Rose. Daisy Hilliard is an author based in York. Her latest non-fiction book, The Second Body, thinks about how the porous boundaries of the Anthropocene affect humans' experiences. She's now working on a new novel, Emergency, which is going to be published in 2022, which will tell stories of global connections and human-non-human relationships within a small rural area of northern England. Daisy Lafarge was born in Hastings and studied at the universities of Edinburgh and Glasgow. Her collection of poetry, Life Without Air, was shortlisted for the T.S. Eliot Prize. Her first debut novel, Paul, was published in 2021. So a very warm welcome to all three of our speakers tonight, and thank you for joining us. Tonight we're going to have two series of readings from our speakers, which will be interspersed with discussion and questions led by Daisy Hilliard. So without further ado, I will hand over to our speakers to begin with the first readings, starting with Alice Hattrick. Over to you, Alice.
Thank you so much. Yes, I'm going to read from my book Ill Feelings, and it's about mine and my mother's experience, or trying to tell our story of our kind of treatment by the medical establishment, and also just kind of people in our lives and society more widely, kind of like living with medically unexplained symptoms of illness, and the kind of diagnoses around symptom syndromes, but it also weaves in other people's stories, so historical figures like 19th century, mainly kind of 19th century literary kind of figures, and then I'd also try and tell the story of our shared diagnosis, which is ME, or chronic fatigue syndrome, as a kind of, or how it was sort of weaponized as a social problem, or how ill health was weaponized as a social problem in the context of the 90s and early 2000s. So I try, it's kind of blends a few different kind of genres. But the bit I'm going to read is about crypt time, which is just an idea of time that I found very helpful, and I think will link with the reading that I'm going to do later on as part, and it was written, the later reading was written as part of a project that I did with, or that is an ongoing project with Julianne Well. So this little section is called Never Ending. Every day that starts, let's just try to have a better day than yesterday, ends in a worse one. Who gave me this shitty advice, or did I make it up? Why am I setting myself such a high standard? My mother says, I'm just going to write today off. It will never be different, I say. Tomorrow will probably not be better. It might well be worse. We cannot keep writing days off as if our normal is anything other than this, as if we should be doing more with our time. The chronic and chronic illness comes from the Greek chronos, meaning time, an abstract, never-ending concept. I do not say that is your internalized ableism talking. I'm sure this tendency would be called chronic perfectionism by someone who does not know her or us. Normal is different when you live on the precipice, on the edge of both wellness and illness. It is living in crypt time, warped, queer, endlessly changed. Alison Kafer's definition of crypt time is extra time. Crypt or sick time is queer, a departure from straight time, where the straight time means a firm delineation between past, present, and future, or an expectation of linear development from dependent childhood to independent reproductive adulthood. Crypt time is different to productive kinds of time, which is really just one narrow, straight, restrictive version of time. Crypt time is straight time extended, stretched out, bent, warped. Crypt time is time that cannot be straightened out. Crypt time is the time of being in hospital for prolonged periods, or institutionalized or in bed in your home most of the time. You can lose a lot of time when you're ill, but you also need more time to do things. You do things slowly, in waves rather than stages. Being crypt, sick, ill, disabled changes your experience of time. The present takes on more urgency as the future shrinks, Kafer writes. The past becomes a mix of potential causes of one's present illness or a succession of wasted time. The future is marked in increments of treatment and survival, even as the future becomes more tenuous. There aren't really specific times of the day, unless they are the times you take your medication, or even days of the week. No Tuesday lunchtimes, no Saturday nights. Last week and in a few months' time don't really exist. All of this means the task of having a better day than yesterday is even more impossible. There are no days or weeks, no yesterday. So what then is trying? What is bettering, let alone today or tomorrow? When there is no straight time, there is no way of measuring these things. The days are really just mornings anyway, or what feels like a smaller and smaller window of being able to stand or sit up, which happens sooner rather than later. Crypt time is failed productive time, the time of not doing and potential undoing. Crypt time reveals itself when you think about the future. Do you see a future in which you will get better, or do you see one in which things might be different, but you will never be cured? Crypt time is failing to make the most of your time. It is failing to fulfill normative expectations of using your time wisely. Crypt time is spent in and with the body-mind, described by Ginny as her companion in Virginia Woolf's The Waves, always sending its signals, the rough black no, the golden come, in rapid running arrows of sensation. It is a night kind of time for Virginia too, obscuring sights and enhancing the other senses. We are out of doors, night opens, night traversed by wandering moths. I smell roses, I smell violets. I see red and blue just hidden. Crypt time is what she describes in her diaries as partly mystical. Something happens in my mind. When you live alone as a crypt, your body is your only companion, where all desires and pains are focused and cannot be redirected. They have nowhere else to go. Your conversation with it is a source of both conflict and joy. Sickness changes time and the pace of life, and in doing so, it changes what health is. Not a system, but a scale, not a battle, but a balance or a flow.
Thanks, Alice. I'm going to read a short section from my book, The Second Body. It's a passage from near the beginning, and I'm thinking about how to make sense of the boundaries and connections between bodies in the world now. What do an American barn owl, a Zimbabwean hippopotamus, and a Norwegian reindeer have in common? What they have in common is that they all have a relationship with your body. They are all, in some sense, your responsibility. There is a way of speaking which implicates your body in everything on Earth. Dead whales have something to do with you. The disorientation of the waxwing is indirectly your problem. The freak storm and the changing seasons are consequences of actions performed by your body. Meanwhile, in the human world, there are still car bombs going off in Baghdad every day. Does this have anything at all to do with you? Moreover, a teenager in Kolkata is missing a thumb and you are wearing a pair of inexpensive gloves. Is there any connection there? The idea that a human body can be responsible for something which bears no tangible relation to it or to its immediate surroundings is not a new idea. But this idea is not one we tend to speak of in everyday language right now. In normal life, a human body is rarely understood to exist outside its own skin. It is supposed to be inviolable. The language of the human animal is that of a whole and single individual. You are encouraged to be yourself and to express yourself, to be whole, to be one. Move away from this personality, self-expression, and you risk going out of your mind, being beside yourself, failing to be true to yourself, hearing other voices, or splitting your personality. None of that sounds good. This careful language is anxious, I think. It's threatening in a desperate way. You need to take care of yourself, it says. You need boundaries. You have to be either here or there. Don't be all over the place. Climate change creates a new language in which you have to be all over the place, and you are always all over the place. It makes every animal body implicated in the whole world. Even the patient who is anesthetized on an operating table, barely breathing, is illuminated by surgeons' lamps, which are powered with electricity, trailed from a plant which is pumping out of its chimneys, a white smoke that spreads itself out against the sky. This is every living thing on Earth. I'm going to stop there and pass over to Daisy.
Thank you. I'm going to begin by reading a few poems from Life Without Air, which is a collection that takes its title from the 19th century scientist Louis Pasteur's term for the process of fermentation, and he called it life without air. And I wouldn't say that air has like a particular fixed meaning throughout the book. I'm interested in it in, I suppose, in various literal and metaphorical senses, both kind of ecologically, but also interpersonally. And I suppose I'm interested in thinking with air as air being something that resists ideas of like purity, like it's always this kind of mongrel that's like made up of lots of different things. So with that in mind, I'm just going to read a few poems from a sequence in the book called Understudies for Air, and then I'm going to go rogue and read some more poems from that sequence that didn't actually make it into the book, that were in a pamphlet that was published previously to it. So, falsification air. What can I pass on, you ask, about methods of detecting the air? It has become so habitual, I am not sure where to begin. Each morning I walk into the world looking for signs. Early, before light is normalized by the shadow of buildings and the gentle fraying of traffic. It seems the signs are most attracted to states of dereliction, To receive them, it helps to be empty, but imbued with residual function, like a disused water tower or any number of withering technologies. Lie back, let the world grow over you like weeds. Consider the sheets of air gridlocked in double glazing. Now are you beginning to understand? Desecration air. The dunes migrate inwards, sag like cellulite from the headland. In birth, you grew maladaptive breathing patterns to survive the air, patterns in which you are now architecturally invested. Your dealings with air are more frequent than ever. Brittle waves of grit clump the wind-lashed marron, who only avoid the sand smothering by growing, syringe-like, into the air, and in so doing, suckle and cleave the dunes around them. Such a boom and bust modality raises the question of who is mother to whom, if your method of resisting an environment becomes in turn the order that generates its form. Also noteworthy was the lack of shivering and fever. Instead, people were finding messages in their bodies they hadn't written. The accurate translations caused many disputes, as the messages seemed to say one thing to one person and another to the next. Slowly, an encyclopedia was compiled to catalogue the valence of each text. No conclusions were reached, but the book grew hair, organs, toes. It was decided the system was malapropic. The most common recorded translation concerned the wooing and handling of an ear of corn. Pyrophoria air. Wildfire lessons in the city. That loneliness catches in the heat, makes spines grow straighter, reverses the neglect of drying leaves. All it takes is gust for order to become mulch, neighbor pulled in the tread of the carpet. Songs in the evening weave their particular Hessian torpor. I found record of such things in the approved blueprints. What concrete lacks in aperture, it makes up for in air. Like dough, we left the city to prove. We mourned lost structures that forewarned of intolerance. Compost heaps, haystacks, a memory of the latter whose tendency to combust should have been portentous, a burning bush, but were praised instead as symbols of a bygone era, pastel, pastoral, excised from the unseen heat of bacteria, coursing through its innards, goading themselves to flame. Grid air. It became clear we were dealing with a wild material, which was itself compositionally flippant. It was also inadvisable to walk without purpose, though flowers retained their crude narrative and birds in the coppiced wood wagged on like always. The air made it easy to get mired in description. Our counters in turn became increasingly organized. We oversaw the construction of aerial harbors, the recasting of certain institutions as beacons, whose former function appeared to be at first without design. Libraries were common, as were schools and places of worship. Some claimed progress or self-improvement as the key, but as another negated, the gymnasiums were virtually air-free. It was courthouses that surprised us most of all, where we had rocked ourselves over and over like scum on a great white wave. Patterns were forming, but still out with our grasp. We moved into close quarters with the air like ethnographers, learned to overlook how it focused our own shadows. As the nights drew in, we gathered threads around us, hemming our breath until morning. False alarm air. I once passed a high-rise as an alarm began to sound. For a while, there was no movement, and then an elderly lady emerged from the front door, flapping across the lawn in a single white towel. She was naked otherwise, still dripping from her shower, a sea green bottle of detergent in hand. Each of her limbs a sprig of pale lavender, protruding in a gesture of genteel and outmoded frailty. We stared at the building, its indifferent gaze, as the siren cut out quick. The towel billowed around her body, a flag to safer days. I glimpsed the podsole belly, the mildew thighs. I was about to walk on when she held out her hand, turned 2 eyes of cracked china and said, "One day I will know how it feels to haul around a body of rotting flowers, to let memory chew holes in my mind like maggots." Then she laughed and started to sing a song whose words were lost to the wail of a younger alarm, just beginning to tease. And I just wanted to end on the coda to the book, which is untitled, and the lines were taken and adapted from Louis Pasteur's lab notes on this discovery of fermentation. In our memoir on spontaneous generation, everything combined to prevent the interference of air. On March 23rd, we filled the shape represented, a most simple method of observing the deadly effect of air. To assure ourselves, we filled 2 tubes. We cited a mineral medium. On April 9th, we composed a liquid. This liquid had previously been left to herself. This liquid, the author says, had a feeble reaction. For the first few days, she remained perfectly clear, then began to grow turbid. On that same day, we first observed a deposit between the mercury and the sides of the tube. Kept at summer heat, she speedily swarmed with organisms. By evening, a tolerable activity had begun to manifest. On the 5th day, a few bubbles betokened. On May 13th, we refrained from impregnating. We examined a drop. She was less vigorous without having actually ceased. Under observation, she seemed to languish. She showed every sign of intense unease and asphyxia, although mobile at the articulations. After having lived without air, we concluded that she could not be suddenly exposed. We were forced to regard her as a distinct species and have employed the vaguest nomenclature, leaving her absolutely intact. She possesses unusual powers of resistance. She may be brought to a state of dry dust and be wafted about by winds. That's me. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to pick up on that idea of the vaguest nomenclature. And I want to ask you a question about being imperfect. Oh, hello. And imperfect beings. Because the artists here in this exhibition are purposefully making objects with mistakes inbuilt, objects they describe as imperfect or having a flaw, breakable with seepage or leakage. And they've spoken, as well as Claire mentioned in the introduction, about mistakes in language and being dyslexic, the difficulty of naming. And Daisy, your writing, this is something that your writing makes me very aware of, the problems of scientific taxonomy and what lies outside ordered language. And Alice, I want to bring these ideas of imperfection into your dialogue with your writing, because you're writing into a movement that's very considerably reimagining the idea of perfection and health and what it is to be hale and whole, or a perfect, a working body. So I guess I wanted to ask you both, what does a beautiful imperfection look like to you? Do you think of yourselves as working with an imperfect language or trying to develop an imperfect language? And what's your relationship with that?
I can try and stumble my way towards an answer. I love the idea of a beautiful imperfection. And yeah, I guess I should say up front that to my great disappointment, I haven't actually been able to make it to see the show physically, but as I've been reading around the material and looking through the images, it was this idea of not exactly failure, but kind of errors, and I guess a kind of allowance for material to have its own will, that I really resonated with in terms of writing and how I think, I suppose particularly about particularly about poetry, where I think I'm interested in trying to, I suppose, allow language to act in this like more associative way that comes before like thinking in a kind of order, which is like definitely representative of these kinds of like scientific systems that you were talking about, Daisy, of like maybe using that language, but like not allowing it to impose any kind of order. Yeah, I don't know if Alice, you have something to say. I'll probably think of something more cogent while you're speaking.
Yeah, no, I was just thinking, what came to mind for me was like the limitations of the language that we have to explain our sensations, maybe that could feel to us like very disturbing or distressing, but when translated into the kind of language that we use in the in a kind of medical scenario, we have to make it we have to sort of translate it into this strange language that doesn't really relate to us. So I write a lot in the book about, like early on, about the language that my mother has to use, this very formal, I would say scientific, but like I don't even know if it is necessarily, but it's like it's not sensory, it's not bodily, it's like it's almost computational, or like she has to use this language that makes her sound like she's a broken like a broken piece of technology, or like she can't use the kinds of ways of expressing herself that she does, for example, with me, who would just kind of understand what she means when she says that, you know, she feels like she's falling down, or she feels like her heart feels a certain way, or her ears feel a certain way. Like she can't communicate in that way in a medical environment without being read as hysterical, or being kind of categorized as hysterical, rather than in need of, if not medical treatment, at least like being treated like a human with a medical problem. So that was what I was thinking about. And also these ideas, or these words like that we in the last, over the time that I worked on this book, obviously we weren't in a pandemic when I started writing it, and then when I was finishing it, we were in lockdown, and we were you know, writing a book about pain and fatigue being vague. Again, this idea of vagueness, like I think that's the nice kind of link, like these symptoms can be so vague that and subjective that they kind of almost don't count as problems that you might be experiencing, and they certainly aren't things that can be taken serious, like demand to be taken seriously, because they belong to so many different medical conditions, and they belong to so many different usages. And something that happened you know, that has happened during the pandemic is that we hear these words like fatigue used even more in even more situations that don't really apply to necessarily like conditions that we would identify as illness. So yeah, I was just thinking about how language can be kind of, or certain terminology can be stretched kind of so thinly, purposefully almost, so that it kind of loses its meaning, and it loses its like people, you don't have to take it seriously, or you don't have to kind of address it as a legitimate distressing kind of experience, because it's kind of like it's applied to everything, it's kind of stuck to everything.
Daisy, did you have anything more to add?
I guess only just like maybe a little bit of like backstory to like where some of the language in the book comes from, which is that I was doing this PhD that kind of involved working alongside scientists, and I was kind of being bombarded with all of this terminology and material that it was very alien to me, because I hadn't kind of formally studied science since my GCSEs, and I didn't have the internal kind of architecture in which to place it or arrange it. And so I think the way that I then processed that was moving through it in this more kind of intuitive, associative way that I think at first it was maybe just felt like a kind of an exercise, but then it began to take on this different form of a different form of significance to me. And I've kind of regurgitated this in talking about this book before as an anecdote, but I find it very helpful for thinking about it. And that's this this anecdote of Lacan talking to his students, where he's saying that they don't understand how useful geology had been to psychoanalysis, because without geology you wouldn't have this model for kind of seeing something as one point on the surface, but then there being depth, and this idea of compression and fossilization, and that then providing a model for the psyche. And so I think this idea of using certain kind of areas of terminology for something completely other than what they're intended for me anyway, can be a really generative way of writing.
Yeah, one thing I really noticed spending some time with both of your books this week, or both your many books between you, was that you're both quite erudite authors, which I guess you've just spoken on a little bit, Daisy. You've got a huge amount of kind of technical knowledge. I mean, Alice, you're covering loads of literary biography, but also there's really detailed stuff about health policy and you know, recent political legislation, how benefits are working in certain ways, and thinking through that. And then Daisy, obviously you're working with a lot of scientific history and philosophies of ecology and of gender. And again, this struck me that there's a resonance with this show where you have these kind of very storied objects which come through often quite specialized processes of making, but the experience of walking through the gallery is not necessarily the experience of those intellectual histories or those kind of specialist processes. I often wonder when people are looking at art, how much they're thinking about this, whether what the relationship, what the experience of the artwork is, either instinctively or authenticated through kind of a knowledge of its background or of its story. And so I kind of, what interested me particularly with your guys' work is that you're mixing this with very intimate emotional writing, and that's still surprising, and it's surprising that it is surprising, but it's a new thing. And I'd be interested to hear about how you see that relationship, I guess, between knowledge and feeling in your own work, or in experiencing something in a gallery, I guess, or through other people's work. Are you readers of boards, or are you people who stroll through a show without looking from side to side?
I do always think that with Julian Will's work is that, you know, especially with like the glass pieces, for example, they're made by, you know, like by learning processes with experts, but that in itself becomes a kind of collaborative exchange, and a productive one. So from what I gather from talking to them, you know, over the years, is that you know, when they go and make the glass pieces, they like, this isn't the kind of work that the glass makers are usually making, right? They're like making they're kind of like kind of testing each other's boundaries in that in the making of the work. But when you see it in the gallery, you don't kind of think about them as blown glass. Well, you almost like don't read them as blown glass pieces. I don't know, like you think you like they're not immediately, you don't, and I think that's kind of the point, is that you don't really read them as produced in the way that you would engage with like a functional object or a decorative object that was made from blown glass or made from glass in some way. And I think that it's not as simple as just putting them in a gallery space. That isn't where it happens in the process of making it that difference. Yeah, that's what struck me when I saw the kind of the smoky bubbly, the ones that you can see here with the yellow. Yeah, but in terms of expertise, like engaging with expertise, I think that it's in my work and in the book, it became really important for me to engage with that as an idea, because this is common to many illness experiences, but in particular chronic ones that people don't really understand, and they're more likely to be associated with gendered experience as well. But if you have a kind of illness experience, you kind of have to become an expert in your own medical condition. And even before you're diagnosed with anything, you kind of have to become an expert in your own feelings and sensations and document them and record them and analyze them and evaluate them in ways that you would do if you were researching anything, in terms of whether it's in any kind of research context. These are the kinds of things that that we learn how to do. So I kind of felt like that was my kind of reasoning behind engaging with these histories and finding also situating like one single diagnosis in the context of a wider social moment was very important, because that is the intersection of like the individual and society. Like that's where it becomes like most kind of interesting for me, I guess. It's like I was trying to understand what had happened to us as like a young woman with like 2 children to look after and a weird diagnosis that no one understood, and then their child having the same kind of experience in a particular time, so in the sort of late 90s, and that was why I wanted to situate it, like tell that story of what was actually happening in the world as well as in my house or in my home kind of thing. So yeah, mixing the like personal and then this like the bigger picture, and not enforcing a hierarchy between them.
Yeah, and this makes me think back to what you were saying about your mother having to find a particular sort of off the peg language for feelings, and the way that there's a kind of elision between the language that's permissible and the feelings that are permissible, because if there is no language to describe certain feelings, then they have to be other feelings described through other words. And that makes me wonder about, I mean, you've thought so much about permissible feelings and authenticated feelings, and there's a lovely quote about Alice James, and her doctors had the power to diagnose and to treat her to legitimize her ill feelings. And Daisy, I was wondering, this makes me think about kind of boundaries for feelings, or how feelings might be legitimized or authenticated or valid in a world that is kind of unboundaried, and where clearly there are problems with a chronic lack of respect or validation or space for feelings. And at the same time, there are kind of feelings that can themselves take up space. I mean, I think the exhibition and your work both make me think about ecological grief and how that can be a double-edged sword, in that the individual experiencing ecological grief can eclipse the perhaps more, well, certainly more urgent suffering that's going on elsewhere, or real phenomena that are happening. So I wondered, yeah, to either of you really, what you think about feelings and boundaries, and how to manage or respect them, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I guess this kind of like relates to the something you were asking in the last question about this kind of relationship between knowledge and feelings, or like the division between them. And I guess one thing I was gonna maybe suggest was sort of like, I'm not sure if those, like, about the opposition of those two things. I don't know about knowledge without feelings, or feelings without knowledge. And like, it just, I think, I mean, there isn't really that much engagement with like Pasteur and other scientists in Life Without Air. But one of the things I did find out in researching him for my PhD was that, like, so much of his theory and language was like completely like predicated on his feelings, and his feelings were of like, he was like incredibly elitist, and like a kind of a classist sense. And, you know, his whole like kind of like germophobia was like, you can draw this line between his like hatred of like the masses and the working classes rising up to kind of take over like the pure body of France. And like, that's kind of how he talks about germs as well. And it could have been different, you know, it could have been like, wow, I've discovered germs and they're this like wonderful, wonderful thing that are like part of the body and a part of ecosystems. And we have this like incredible symbiotic relationship with them, but it's not, it's this language of like threat and invasion. And so, and I think that's probably like true of like so much of like what we call like Western science, or kind of like there's just yeah, just kind of feelings like shot all the way through, things that then become like codified as knowledge, I suppose.
Yeah, definitely. The what you're just saying about the that it reminds me of like the way that we speak about like the immune system being this kind of battleground, you know, like we and kind of projecting almost like class and gendered roles onto like the cells of our bodies and what they do as well, like, you know, so it does, it's almost like an infection itself, because this feeling that like a T cell is like the big macho hero coming in to save the day, and then like the other cells that just sort of clean up, and you know, like they're all sort of this way of thinking becomes as well as a kind of as well as the idea that, you know, one person's immune system can be better than someone else's, and therefore they are sort of more or less prone to survival effectively and productivity. So I think all these things, you know, like these are ideas, but they're ideas that live in the body if they're projected onto the cells that, you know, that are in us. So I think it can make something even more potent and even harder to disrupt if it feels so essential to the way that we understand ourselves. Yeah, I was also thinking about like this phrase, and I can't find it, but I think my mom said it, but it's the thing that we all kind of say sometimes is that we know things in our body, or like I can feel it in my, like I just know it, like I can't prove it, but I know it in my body, like I know it's true. And I think that distinction between fact and being something that has that's evidenced, and then feeling being something that can't be proved or can't be qualified, like there could still be, you know, a lot of use in feeling, just because there is no kind of method of like scanning or imaging or evidencing it.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask about, Alice, I know you're working with the artists on a gardening project. And one of the works here that I love, or even kind of the idea of it I love, is that a kind of ungardening project that's happening outside the gallery space, that they're allowing weeds to grow, not spraying the space. And there's a kind of flourishing or rampantness to the kind of extended gallery there. Not very rampant, as you can see here. I guess it's January. Yeah. But even the idea of that is appealing to me, I suppose, because it seems like a kind of a work of that allows something else, something to do something in a way that gardening can be. It's a kind of making space, I guess. And Daisy, you write a lot about silenced beings, I guess. Women, certainly. I'm thinking about your cartographer's wife and your novel, in which a young woman is kind of in many ways quietened, but also about non-humans and other than human beings. And I think that both of you in your writing pull off this very unusual thing, which is to unsilence not just your own voice, but to kind of create some kind of unsilenced space. So I wondered whether you might both speak a little bit about how you did that, or whether you were thinking about that. And I guess maybe I'm interested not only as writers or artists, but also just as ordinary, real people, how that difficult movement might be thought about or even done.
Yeah, that's a really great great and insightful question. I guess the idea of silence or being silenced is I guess interesting, because I think maybe in relation to like what Will and Julia say about this difficult relationship to language, like I think I go to writing because I find language really hard and like trying to articulate anything really difficult. It's this kind of like always this ongoing process of translation, and I suppose it's also, I think that writing through, I suppose, kind of like quietened or silenced ecological themes or gendered themes. I think sometimes it's in reaction to kind of what you were saying in the last question about like reacting to this idea of like expertise or mastery, and not wanting to like try and narrate that, and also maybe seeing this like tactical alliance between like quietened or silenced positions, and not maybe saying that they have like a kind of essential connection or they're like collapsible to each other, but like some kind of like sympathetic relation that can be, I think, used in like in writing or in making something. I've also I need to keep thinking about it.
Something that as part of because I was a child when I was like poorly and being taken to the doctor all the time by my mum, my like response or my reaction was to like not speak. So I just like refused to talk to them. And it took me like the course of working on the book for like 4 or 5 years to change, to like realize what my, or like rewrite my interpretation of that act, because it's obviously like an act of resistance. Like, I'm not going to talk to you because I don't trust you with my, first of all, my feelings, but also my account of my feelings. Like, I know you're going to turn this against me, or you're going to use my words against me, so I'm just not going to speak. But I think because as a result of that experience, I kind of associated not being able to speak with like, oh, this is this kind of a symptom of my illness experience, is that I don't have any words for what I'm feeling, because illness destroys language. This like kind of partly true that, you know, like if you're in pain, you're not going to be articulate about your pain or anything, probably. You're just going to be wailing or screaming or whatever. So that this kind of I think this myth that I had, that the origin of the myth that I had no words for my illness experience, came from my own resistance to speaking in a medical kind of situation, or any kind of authoritarian situation where someone else has more power than you. So it took me like, you know, so many years to realize like, well, I do have language, just like my mother has language for her ill feelings. It's just, it doesn't sound like the kind of things that we should be saying, or it's not like acceptable what we're saying, or it takes us longer to say it, or it doesn't really make any sense, or, you know, like, it's all these other, or no one cares, so no one's listening, or whatever. Like, it's not that there isn't any language, it's just that it doesn't sound like right to, you know, it's not acceptable in that authoritarian situation. So that, like, when me and Julia and Will are thinking about this garden that we're making, which is in process, but has been in process for quite a while now, and it got kind of held up with the pandemic and everything, but also we're just kind of taking our time with it. But it's at Flat Time House, which is in Peckham, and it was the house and studio of John Latham, who was I think he lived there like until like in the 90s. He lived there mainly, and it's a really small garden, but his kind of ideas, he had a lot of sort of theories about things, like a whole kind of cosmology of ideas, but he thought a lot about kind of authorities and authoritarian knowledge, and kind of how to resist that kind of knowledge, or resist that, and also resist that kind of time. He had a lot of theories about time, but he thought like the role of the artist would be to kind of think further ahead than a kind of short generational time scale, and to kind of to kind of improve societal conditions, basically. So that's something that we're also thinking about in that context. How can we kind of explore these ideas of resisting authoritarian forms of knowledge? And one of the ways would be to introduce plants that kind of do their own thing, or have their own kind of they like self-sow, or they kind of have these kinds of ways of reproducing that are not dependent on like humans. So there's ways in which we're like exploring those ideas in the garden there as well.
Yeah, that's yeah, I just wanted to kind of pick up on some of your points of what you were saying about the idea of resistance, and like I think yeah, Daisy, you mentioned the novel and the character in my novel who like loses her voice, and I suppose in like a similar sense, I didn't really think of that as like a loss as such. It was more like a kind of the language that was around her and that she knew wasn't one that was doing her any good. So actually like the silence is like a good form of resistance, which sounds like kind of similar to what you did as a child, Alice. And so I think there's a kind of, yeah, definitely something kind of like generative maybe in thinking about that kind of like silent resistance.
That's really lovely. You both brought us back really beautifully to kind of mistaken imperfect language. Like silence seems like a good solution to it. And we don't really have time for any more questions, but I do have one more that I really want to ask you, so I'm going to ask you anyway. And because it's about silliness, and I'd like to hear what you both say about this, that Julia and Will write about how they wanted the works to be silly in some sense, and they write about the relationship between, I suppose, silliness as resistance to kind of certain power dynamics and ideas about class and taste. And I love that some of the work that they were creating was designed to be the precise shade of pea. Daisy, you're a really funny poet, and that's really unusual. Your language is really playful, and like you were reading today about the birds wagging on, and I love your poem about the electron touching itself. And Alice, the humor, I guess in your writing is certainly a different kind of humor, but there is definitely a really bleak comedy or kind of farce to this kind of faceless, or like the experience of illness coming into contact again and again with the total lack of sort of faceless lack of recognition of it. It makes me, yeah, think of a lot of the bleakest funny literature. So I just wanted to ask you both quickly, like, yeah, why silliness? This is something I've thought about with ecological theory as well, that a lot of the writing about apocalypse and disaster, it is quite humorous, and I wondered what you see is the role of humor, silliness, playfulness in relation to these quite grim issues of oppression and apocalypse and all the things we've been having loads of fun talking about tonight.
I think there's always that idea that like it's a coping mechanism, isn't it? Like humor is a coping mechanism. But it's also just like your personality. It's when you stop being able to separate out like what's a coping mechanism from just an aspect of my personality, or what's an aspect of my illness and what's an aspect of my personality. And the way that these things can kind of, I think humor is a way to communicate that messiness and that like kind of inability to discern what's real and what's not, what's in your mind and what's in your body. You know, like it's disruptive in that sense. So I feel like if anything, it's like an easy strategy to use in writing. And yeah, that it would be, that it's always inappropriate, or that it could be inappropriate, or like potentially. Like you shouldn't joke about that kind of thing being exactly what we'll end up doing, because it's like I can do what I want. Like I'm going to resist this like rule that like if it's a serious problem, I've got to speak about it in a certain way. But yeah, I guess there's a difference when like a politician is joking around rather than taking an issue seriously, and then like us joking around about an issue. I feel like there's maybe a distinction there.
Yeah, I guess it kind of like, it depends like what's at stake. Like, you know, silliness in like a sculpture or a poem or like a passage of text is maybe very different to like someone who is like wielding it with like real power that will like, yeah, kind of like affect policy or something. But I suppose on like the level of art, it's, yeah, I definitely agree with everything you just said about like a kind of coping mechanism, and also the sense of like, it's just like existential literature, it's like if you're on the edge of the precipice, like you're either going to fall off it or you just have to kind of like laugh laugh into the face of the abyss or something. And I think that has like ecological resonance as well, because like how, you know, there is a place for grief, but there's a place for just like the absurdity of it as well. And I think absurdity is more, it kind of seems to be like a more like connected form of like relating to like crisis and tragedy than denial, maybe, I don't know, which is like another mode I think that people can go into when just like kind of confronted with grief and doom. So but also language is very silly and I love it, and I guess it just like it excites me. And so there's a sense where it feels to me at once like the most serious thing and also the silliest thing. And I think if I try to put it on any like if I just try and reduce it to like being either one of those things rather than letting them kind of like mingle together, then I lose interest. So yeah.
Yeah, and I like what you say that about that, and about the kind of the idea of intimate experience and knowledge both being things that exist in the world, so they're things that you write about, and similarly kind of comedy is something that happens, and therefore like with language it would be perhaps more effortful to keep it out than to allow it in. Perhaps we should move on to readings now. Daisy, as you read last time, would you be happy to read first this time?
Yeah, sure. I'm just going to read a short like prose piece, which is in a very different tone to the first reading, essentially just about getting a microscope during lockdown as a silly coping mechanism. Okay. And I think there should be an image of some green worms coming up onto screen. Before all this, the 2020 of my mind was filled with travel and vegetating animals. It was the last year I would have access to the small grant that came with my PhD, the compromising kind where you pay up front and invoice later, to be used strictly for travel costs incurred for research. My plans included visiting the biology station in Roscoff in Brittany, where I had hopes of seeing S. roscoffensis, a species of tidal flatworm that spends its time moonlighting as seaweed on sandy Atlantic beaches. S. roscoffensis, also known as the Roscoff worm or the mint sauce worm, was of interest to late 19th century biologists who observed that the tiny bright green worms appeared to be filled with a chlorophyll-like substance. But that couldn't be right, they thought, because plants formed one branch of life and animals another. Animals don't photosynthesize. Not until Scottish polymath Patrick Geddes, then stationed in Roscoff as a 24-year-old student of marine biology, discovered that actually some animals do. He noted that the abundance of worm colonies in shallow pools during fine weather was very striking, and through a series of experiments, he was able to determine that the Roscoff worms did indeed photosynthesize, and concluded that they may not unfairly be called vegetating animals. I'd hoped to spend a few days of spring 2020 with these vegetal animals myself, but as March turned into April, all these plans were pushed into the anxious, indeterminate future. A novel pathogen was circulating, and during those early days in the epidemiological dark, intense scrutiny of unseen microorganic life was becoming a fraught part of day-to-day existence. There was plenty of cause for paranoia in my personal life too, and somehow in the midst of all this, I thought it would be a good idea to get a microscope. I couldn't get to the Roscoff worms, but maybe I thought I could find an approximation closer to home. A month or so into the first lockdown, I used the travel grant with some persuasion to purchase a beginner's microscope, perfect for kids and students, as the online description put it. On my government-sanctioned daily walks to nearby city parks and woodland, I collected water from ponds, pools, bodies of stagnant water, puddles in the cavities of tree trunks. This newfound attention to water, its places and qualities, became a ritual in itself. affording me a rhythm and focus outside of my thoughts and fears. The next stage of the ritual took place at my kitchen table, where my microscope was set up. I would begin by placing a drop of water on a glass slide and soon lose myself to hours of enraptured observation, witnessing life, which seemed oblivious to the world raging around it, unfold on the slide. The pond water samples were my favorite. Each drop was a living stained glass window, an impossibly wrought lattice of green and gold. Slowly, I began to identify what I was looking at. The gliding thumbprint bodies of flatworms, coils of filamentous green algae, fanged insect larvae, and crystalline diatoms. In one fortuitous sample from a swampy part of my local woods, where the red soil is staked with field horsetail and the shallow water capped with a mercury-like meniscus, I found tangles of Vorticella, bell-shaped ciliates whose glitchy movements rank them among the fastest moving organisms. Mostly, I felt I had passed through into another world. In Drops of Water, a guide to amateur microscopy by the 19th century scientist Agnes Catlow, I found a good description of this ethereal transportation. Quote, "My readers must fancy themselves spirits, capable of living in a medium different from our atmosphere, and so pass with me through a wonderful brazen tunnel with crystal doors at the entrance." I felt as though I was peeking through a crack in the crystal doors, and I never wanted to look away. Keen as I was to learn about the minute inhabitants of water, I also knew my motivations were more meditative than scientific. For me, the ritual of microscopy was something that could only have come out of that time when it seemed as though the world had stopped turning. As for the vegetating animals, my approximation arrived surprisingly early on. My lens was focused on the translucent body of a mosquito larva, its segments expanding and contracting as it munched on something out of view. As a result, I paid little attention to the slow-moving blob of green that drifted into sight and stayed put when the larva slithered away a minute or so later. The green thing was unassuming at first, but the closer I looked, the more it seemed to glisten, as if filled with emerald sand. Some weeks later, I would identify this as Paramecium bursaria, a single-celled ciliate filled with endosymbiotic cells of algae. These zoochlorella algae live in the paramecium's cytoplasm and provide it with food via photosynthesis, while the paramecium affords the algal cells greater movement and protection. The emerald sand was symbiosis, or what Patrick Geddes called reciprocal accommodation, one species living inside another, my makeshift Roscoff worms. In her preface to Drops of Water, Agnes Catlow introduces an unnamed microorganism as a community. Quote, "It is not one being alone, but is formed of hundreds of minute beings, all enjoying life and grouped together in this curious manner for mutual support." In this mutual support, I couldn't help but hear an echo of mutual aid, and I wondered if my attraction to the apparently anarchic sublime of life and liveliness in the pond water was connected to the enforced isolation of lockdown. I was craving the company of other organisms, and life in a drop of water was as close to a crowd as I could get. During a time of fear and revulsion towards microscopic life, I was grateful for these encounters with the micro non-human, and the reminder that wonder is not predicated on travel or expertise. When I shared the first images I had taken from my microscope on social media, mentioning the now unusable travel grant, a poet commented, as if channeling Agnes Catlow, "This is travel." Thanks.
Thank you. We now have a reading from Alice, and then if anybody has any questions, please put them in the chat, because we'll have time for a couple of questions at the end.
So I'm going to read the text I wrote for this Blacktown House open weekend. I actually have some pictures, I just remembered. This is the garden. This is going to be like an disability access eventually. This is where it'll come through. And there are some nice kind of pieces of glass that are left over from previous shows, and also John Nathan's kind of art practice. But as you can see, there's lots of weedy things growing. This is his studio, and it kind of has this kind of conservatory part to it. And there are actually plants, like the soil, in the outside soil and the inside soil are kind of like joined up underneath this glass piece. So he was very interested in gardening. But yeah, this is the space generally. And then these are the plant pressings that we showed in the space during the weekend. And yeah, they relate to the text. This is the inside. So you can see they're like plants growing. But they relate to the text I'm going to read. Yeah, it is August and the notes in my phone are preoccupied with dreaming. My clothes are machine stitched to my body and he had to cut them off me. Everyone was saying how my dog's teeth were disgusting. Another note reads, I feel compelled to do absolutely nothing. I want to do nothing, to be someone of something or something of no or slight value or size, to be nothing, meaning also free, without the need to fill up space, to be productive. Why is nothing so hard, especially when I feel like hell? I have retreated to the house. I do not leave the small garden or the living room where I also work and make things and fix pressed plants to paper with small pieces of masking tape in front of the television. Aside from a short walk in the North London suburb my stepmother chose to move to when she was 28 years old, which is 6 years younger than I am now. As the sun fades, I walk to the North Circular, where there are patches of tended wildness, foxholes, allotments, and peace. Aside from all the cars, I see the least amount of people you could see in the city. Feeling less seen means feeling less exposed, vulnerable, or scared, a physical rather than a mental state. The book of ill feelings is finished and published, but the illy felt life carries on. In the winter, we go out in the early afternoon, but we started walking later and later, and now we don't usually get to the cemetery before the gates close at 6 p.m. I think I have been partly avoiding going there. Now we, me and the dog that is, don't get out until the early evening. We walk slowly because the dog hasn't been spayed and insists on sprinkling urine every few meters, usually balanced on her front two legs like a clown play acting on a tightrope. Our walk is a loop under the Northern Line and back on ourselves, down a long straight road to a pasture maintained by volunteers, where people in their early 20s still living at home smoke joints and relax in the evening sun, the most policed road in the city a few meters away. I snap the stems of bright red dock leaves, curling and drying on the plant, which I will take home to press, or heat in rainwater to make an orange-pink dye. The newer leaves look like spinach or chard, which I should be watering in the raised beds reserved for disabled people that I promised to look after at the allotment nearby. I had been avoiding that place too. Leaving the pasture, we walk alongside and then over the North Circular, but there are walls and fences and trees are planted along it, so it's more audible than visible. There is a lot of basket willow or common ossia, thought to have been introduced to the UK in ancient times. Ossia withies, the willow's strong, flexible stems, were traditionally used for making containers to hold things in, or screens, or fish traps. Basket willow feeds the caterpillars of moths. It provides early nectar and pollen for bees and other insects, and birds nest in its branches. But ossia, like all willows, is also grown for its ability to absorb heavy metals and is often planted to clean up contaminated waste ground, which is probably why they are planted along the most polluted road in London, where I imagine few birds would choose to roost. Circling back towards the house, I collect tall rocket to press while it's still yellowy green before it dries brown, breaks off and turns to tumbleweed. The plant is native to the western part of the Mediterranean basin in Europe and northern Africa. and has been widely naturalized throughout most of the world through contaminated crop seeds. It was nevertheless a rare plant in the UK until it was brought back by troops returning from the First World War battlefields. To disperse its seeds, the plant breaks away from the ground at the base and tumbles along with the wind. It can and does grow in any soil, including sand, and is frequently found on rubbish tips and waste ground and by railways and roads. Here, above the North Circular, it seems to actually grow in the road itself. At home, making things feels like changing them rather than producing something new. Pressed plants become stiff and strong, the water extracted by old drawings that sucked or paper that got dirty and which has already dried countless plants before. It is very different to writing on a screen, which is almost just as unprofitable but somehow immaterial, born of stolen time, to be saved somewhere in the void and returned to later. Writing happens in crypt time, passing unnoticed in the way that it does. It's not linear or straight, does not move forwards and backwards. It is the time of never reaching life's milestones, never producing children. Crypt time is lost time, but it is also a way of imagining ourselves differently. A herbarium is a lot like a crypt time diary in a way. It records time passing, a moment in plant life, but also the way a lifetime could loop and bend, the way it could break off and tumble away. I get an email about how messy my section of the disabled beds at the allotment is, that just planting and leaving it is no way to cultivate any plot. I reply to tell them that, as they have noticed, I have not had the capacity to maintain the beds properly this summer. They already emailed a while ago to say that I should be able to weed the plot as I am not physically disabled. I did not reply to that one. They tell me to let them know if this is the case. All we see is an untidy plot, they reply, regardless whether that person has disabilities. When I go to the allotment, it isn't even that bad. There is chard and kale and fennel growing close together in one of the beds, and red amaranth, also known as Love's Lies Bleeding, which has somehow survived my neglect and all the bindweed. But there are lots of other weeds growing in between the beds, the wood chips from last year having rotted down. Ragwort, oxalis and ragweed, dandelion, creeping Charlie, smartweed and dead nettle. I've dyed fabrics with some of these plants too, which I have cut and stitched together. Most can be eaten, are medicinal and provide nectar to pollinators and forage for animals. As I begrudgingly pull them up, a toad jumps out, the most beautiful colour I've ever seen. The dog goes after it, but I know from experience that she'll not be able to catch it.
Thanks both. It's nice to hear about you doing something in the aftermath of writing a book, writing something different from writing a book. I'm also very familiar with those passive-aggressive allotment emails. The sense that the weeds are threatening other people's space.
Oh yeah, for sure. I know when I went and I was like, oh my God, mine is nowhere near the worst. I think everyone had just abandoned them after, because like lockdown had lifted. So it was like, okay, everyone just like, no one's at the allotment basically. Everyone's just gone having fun somewhere.
Yeah, and I mean, what's a weed anyway? Maybe you're trying to grow those things. It's kind of, no. But then, yeah, I guess maybe people that there are questions of taste and power probably there as well. Sure. Does anybody have any questions? If so, please do type them into the chat. Okay, so there's one from Claire. Thank you. A question for you all. We were talking at the beginning about the errors and mishaps in relation to language. I wonder if you could talk about how you all experience or approach the process of error in relation to your writing.
Error in relation to writing is quite hard to think about because, you know, an error should be unintentional, and then if you're thinking about errors, then it's intentional. So it's a bit of like, can be a bit of like a conundrum or something. But I'm interested in, I suppose, like typos and like typing the wrong word and then that actually having like a more interesting form or set of associations on the page than what you intended to write, in the same way that, like, you know, like slips of the tongue are notoriously very like telling. But that seems like quite like maybe like a marginal form of error as opposed to something bigger. I think I maybe think about failure as like a bigger thing in relation to my writing practice than error, maybe. Although I guess does error have like a link to errancy, like wandering? Is that the same root? Does anyone know? Like errant.
Yeah, I would guess so. It must be the same to deviate.
Yeah, I would make some kind of tangential connection to error that way, in the sense of like trying to follow deviations and wandering, and allowing like things to kind of trail off and not sticking to what they should be doing.
Yeah, that seems to be, like, would be a more kind of productive or like interesting way to think about it, I think. I'm also interested in this idea of unproductivity, I guess, and like spending your time in a way that isn't deemed productive. Yeah, so I think like that would be where I would be like have my interests more than rather than like mistakes or like that definition of error. But I think in relation to Julian Rule's collaboration, I think it's something that can be productive in collaboration, because you could say something that someone doesn't quite understand, or that they take in a way that is then kind of generates new conversations and meanings. Whereas I think it's hard to do that on your own, because I don't know who you'd be like, where the misinterpretation could be. So I think in terms of mishap and errors in their work, I think like that could be like where that's happening the most. But I think exactly, like making a decision to make a mistake is not it's not a mistake because it's purposeful.
Daisy, what about you? Yeah, thanks for asking me, because I was thinking, is it weird if I don't answer that, or is it well, yeah, Alice, what you say makes me think about like an error. I guess it's a kind of interaction, isn't it? It's a I've just been reading some poetry that's the poet speaking their thoughts into dictation software, and then the dictation software kind of gets it down all wrong, but you can see where it's got wrong, and it's really funny. Obviously it kind of comes out as really stupid, but similarly that it's like the process of collaboration where an error is generated by like a meeting or a collision between things, which is kind of interesting. I think personally what you said, Daisy, speaks to me, that the literature I've always loved has been kind of digressive and errant and making sort of weird connections. And then just in a really personal way, the word error, I don't necessarily experience errors in the writing so much as just the experience of publishing often feels like an error to me. I find it all just like really embarrassing. It's really nice to be published and I love to write, but I also sometimes find it, I don't think why I don't really know why I do persist. So yeah, there's a kind of question over that for me.
I'll mute myself. Hello. Thank you all so much for such a wonderful discussion, and really kind of teasing out so many different points there. And I'm also just incredibly grateful for you, for your honesty, and sharing those wonderful readings with us tonight. On behalf of Henry Moore Institute, I would invite the audience to join me in thanking our guests, Alice Hattrick, Daisy Lafarge and Daisy Hilliard, for their wonderful contributions and chairing tonight. And thank you to everyone who has joined us tonight for tuning in, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.